An ex-British Army sniper was taken into police custody for repeatedly beating his girlfriend in December of 2021. Junior Fordwor, who reportedly served with the Royal Fusiliers from age 16 to 22, first met cosmetics model Stephanie Render on a dating app in the spring of 2020. They remained casual acquaintances for about a year before sparking up a dating relationship in April of 2021. 26-year-old Fordwor began exhibiting violent tendencies on September the 21st of that year when he became jealous over another man's Instagram picture, which Render had liked. He allegedly screamed at her and pushed her to the floor, then continued to belittle her while outright denying the assault ever took place. A second, more serious incident occurred about 2 months later, after Render went on a night out in Manchester with some friends. Throughout the evening, Fordwor bombarded Render with messages asking where she was, who she was with, and when she'd be back. The 27-year-old woman eventually went back to a friend's house to charge her phone and replied to Fordwor. The latter then showed up at the address and became aggressive, shouting at her and slapping her in the face. When they returned to the Salford flat they shared later that night, Fordwor lost his temper again. He grabbed Render by the throat and strangled her, causing her to lose consciousness for a few seconds. Less than a month later, Fordwor physically assaulted her yet again after seeing a message on her phone that was sent by another man. Then a week after that incident, Fordwor began verbally berating Render out of nowhere before tossing her against a bedpost, destroying her TV and throwing various items around the house. This proved to be the final straw for their relationship, and Fordwor was arrested shortly thereafter. In court, the man claimed that his mental instability and proclivity to commit violence stemmed from the lasting effects of his army experiences, as well as his traumatic childhood. He'd reportedly lost his mother to drug use at a very young age, while his father was locked up in prison for dealing drugs. He also claimed to be suffering from PTSD brought on by his time as an infantryman. The judge at Manchester Crown Court accepted his defense and handed down a suspended 21-month jail sentence as punishment for the prolonged campaign of abuse against Render. Fordwor was also ordered to pay the latter about $460 in compensation, as well as complete 25 rehabilitation days and 100 hours of unpaid work. Number 6. Zack Stacy. In November of 2021, a disturbing home surveillance video surfaced online in which former pro football player Zack Stacy was shown viciously beating his ex-girlfriend in front of their infant son. The footage depicted Stacy, who was allegedly upset over rent money, tossing the victim around the living room like a rag doll, sending her crashing into a television set, which then fell on top of her. It would later emerge that the man had actually carried out multiple separate attacks on the woman, identified as Kristen Evans. The latter told investigators that on several occasions, Stacy had beaten her by punching her legs, slapping her, picking her up by her arms, and throwing her into a window which broke. Evans provided photographic evidence of the injuries she sustained, which consisted of visible slashes and bruises all over her body. Following the beatings shown in the home surveillance video, which occurred in mid-August, the Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida obtained a warrant for the former pro athlete's arrest. Although he reportedly fled the state in the incident's immediate aftermath, Stacy eventually returned and was found in Orlando, where he was finally arrested. He said that Evans had provoked him by asking for money and even tried claiming that the home video of him beating her was staged. Stacy's defense of his behavior proved ineffective, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to 1 count of misdemeanor domestic violence and 2 counts of misdemeanor criminal mischief. In late February of 2023, he was sentenced to 6 months in jail, followed by a year of probation. Number 5. Faith Cox. The toxic aftermath of a Texas couple's failed relationship landed them in international news headlines in late 2017. Initial reports on the matter revealed that 21-year-old Christopher Procopia had been arrested for allegedly breaking into his ex-girlfriend's home in Temple and carving an X into her chest with a box cutter. The young man was charged with burglary of a habitation with the intent to commit other crimes, a felony that carries a maximum 99-year prison term. However, as the police investigation unfolded, new details came to light that appeared to exonerate Procopia of any wrongdoing. At the time of the alleged attack, he'd actually been 65 miles away from his ex's house and had a family selfie to prove it. Procopia's mother had posted a group picture of the family gathering with a timestamp and location data that had made it impossible for him to have been the perpetrator of the attack on his former girlfriend, later identified as Faith Cox. 9 months after his arrest, Procopio was cleared of all charges while Cox was taken into police custody for making the false claims against her boyfriend. She declined a jury trial and pleaded no contest to the charge against her, for which she was given 12 months deferred adjudication probation and ordered to pay $2,000 in restitution to Procopio. Number 4. Yuka Takaoka. Japanese police were called to an apartment building in Shinjuku, Tokyo on May the 23rd of 2019. Responding law enforcement encountered 21-year-old Yuka Takaoka, a Hostess Club employee, in the lobby. In a now infamous photograph, the young woman was shown covered in blood, ignoring an officer as she sat on the floor with a phone to her ear, all while smoking a cigarette. As the police would subsequently learn, Takaoka had viciously attacked her live-in boyfriend, Phoenix Luna. Earlier that night, she had reportedly found pictures of Luna being intimate with another woman on his phone, which prompted her to stab him in the abdomen as he slept. Takaoka then brought the wounded man into the lobby of their building, at which point the authorities were called. Luna was hospitalized in critical condition but ultimately survived. When accounting for her violent outbursts, Takaoka claimed that she just couldn't help it because she loved him so much and had become utterly distraught upon discovering the incriminating picture on his phone. In December of 2019, she was found guilty of attempted murder and consequently sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. The case garnered considerable attention online, with many likening Takaoka to a yandere, a phrase used to describe a female anime character who suddenly becomes aggressive, deranged, and homicidal towards a lover. Number 3. Kevin Justin Mayorga. In the early morning of January the 30th of 2023, officers from the Miami-Dade Police Department were dispatched to a local apartment complex in response to a report of a domestic disturbance. Upon arrival, the officers heard a loud argument transpiring inside one of the residences. A woman then let out an agonized scream and implored law enforcement to simply kick the door in. Police forced their way inside, whereupon they came upon an adult male and adult female in the entryway. The man, later identified as Kevin Justin Mayorga, fled into another room, but officers gave chase. When they caught up with him, they tried detaining him, but he resisted. Mayorga reportedly started swinging at the officers and clipped one of them in the eye with a handcuff. He subsequently had both his arms and legs restrained while the police sorted things out. Upon speaking with the female resident, investigators were informed that Mayorga had sunk his teeth into her pet snake and bitten its head clean off moments before officers barged in. The man consequently had a count of animal cruelty with intent to kill added to his list of offenses, which already included false imprisonment and resisting arrest. He was held at the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center on a $15,000 bond. Number 2. Udele Burno. The police in Prince George's County, Maryland, received a report that someone was stuck underneath a car at 6102 Floral Park Road in Brandywine on August the 20th of 2022. The trapped individual was subsequently identified as 40-year-old Shamato Abdullah Clark, who'd sustained severe trauma to much of his body. Paramedics ultimately pronounced him dead at the scene. Law enforcement determined that the vehicle Clark had been pinned beneath was registered to his girlfriend, Udele Burno, aged 38. The preliminary police investigation found that Burno had intentionally struck Clark with her car, as there weren't any indications that she tried to brake before ramming into him. She was arrested at the scene and during her subsequent interview at the station was observed with bruises and scrapes on her arm, indicating there might have been some sort of hand-to-hand physical struggle as well. Witness testimony would go on to detail the couple's checkered past for investigators. Apparently, they'd been dating for a few years, but split up before rekindling things a few months prior to the fatal collision. According to police records, Prince George's County officers had been sent to the Floral Park Road residence on multiple occasions leading up to Clark's death. In each instance, the 911 caller indicated that Burno was trying to run them over with her car. As of the latest developments, the woman was still awaiting the next steps of her case's legal proceedings. Before we move on to number 1, in case you still want to watch part 1, then you can stay tuned after. It's coming up right after this. Number 1. Michael Caine. 23-year-old Michael Caine went ballistic on his longtime girlfriend, Hermione Deakin, after she refused his offer of a ride home from a party on April the 10th of 2021. The young man, a resident of Old Corwin, North Wales, wasn't happy when Deakin informed her that she was going to the house party in Bangor that night. he became obsessed with finding out who she was with and what they would be doing. At around 4:30 in the morning, Caine went to the party to collect Deakin, but she indicated that she'd changed her mind about going home. She offered him money for the gas he'd wasted on the drive over, at which point he snapped. According to subsequent reports, Caine grabbed Deakin through the open car window and went into a wheel spin before taking off down the street with the young woman still dangling from the side of the vehicle. He drove about 50 feet before Deakin dislodged from his grasp and hit the ground hard. The young woman was taken back inside the house in hysterics while Caine fled the scene. She was left with severely scraped knees that were covered in blood, as well as bruising under her arm where Caine had grabbed hold of her. Deakin reported her boyfriend of 4.5 years to the authorities, and he was arrested a few days later. In a victim impact statement, Deakin said she felt lucky to be alive because she could have so easily been squashed by any of the several parked cars that had lined the roadway that night. In the summer of 2022, Caine pleaded guilty to dangerous driving and was jailed for 10 months. He was also prohibited from driving for a period of 2 years and 5 months and was given a lifetime restraining order. Number 7. Trimaan Dhillon. Following their breakup in the summer of 2016, Lance Corporal Trimaan Dhillon developed an obsession for his former girlfriend, Alice Ruggles. The latter had repeatedly reported Dhillon to the authorities as he'd allegedly led a campaign of harassment against her. He bombarded her with Number 7 to publish intimate photos online, hacked into her Facebook account, and claimed he'd end his life if she didn't take him back. In late September of 2016, Dhillon traveled 120 miles from his barracks in Scotland to his ex-girlfriend's flat in Gateshead, England, to leave chocolates and flowers on the windowsill. He also left the woman a threatening voicemail, claiming that he didn't want to kill her. The authorities were reported to have ignored 24-year-old Ruggles' pleas for help on each of the occasions she'd reached out to them. Angry over their lack of action, the young woman told her sister at one point, "They will respond once he has stabbed me." On October the 12th, Dhillon drove to her home again, gained access through a back window and waited for her to return from work. He ambushed and overpowered Ruggles when she came home and forced her into her shower. The soldier slashed her neck with a 6-inch knife at least 6 times, cutting through to the spine. The victim's body was found by her roommate, who, in a chilling phone call to the emergency services, named Dhillon as the likely culprit, describing him as an absolute psychopath. He was arrested at the barracks but later denied murder at Newcastle Crown Court, claiming Ruggles had fallen on a carving knife during an argument. He was ultimately found guilty, and the judge, who described the crime as an act of utter barbarism, sentenced him to life with a minimum of 22 years served. Number 6. Keating. While talking to his friends, Englishman Matthew Wormleighton had once described his girlfriend, Keating, as a nutter, but noted that their intimate life was really good. The couple had met in 2018 and there was a reported toxic dynamic to their relationship, which at times could be volatile. In May of 2021, they were heatedly arguing at their home in Chilthorne Domer near Yeovil, Somerset, while under the influence of alcohol and illicit substances. When looking back on the sequence of events that followed, Keating claimed that her boyfriend had thrown her on the bed and choked her with both hands. He then let her go, and in the moments that followed, the woman grabbed a knife from a kitchen drawer and threw the blade, which struck Wormleighton in the torso. Keating called the emergency services upon realizing her boyfriend was hurt, and she was subsequently taken into custody. The knife had gone 4 inches deep into Wormleighton's chest, and the stab wound proved fatal. During the legal proceedings that followed, Keating maintained that the killing had been accidental and that she'd never meant to hurt her boyfriend. A judge noted that when she threw the knife, her boyfriend didn't present an immediate threat to her. In late July of 2022, a jury cleared the woman of murder but found her guilty of manslaughter, for which she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Number 5. James Polkinghorne. On Mother's Day 2012, Australian man James Polkinghorne was stabbed to death at the home of his partner in Marrickville in Sydney's inner west. 28-year-old Polkinghorne had become increasingly aggressive towards his girlfriend, Jessica Silva, also in her 20s at the time, allegedly due to his repeated use of the drug ice. He sent the woman deranged and threatening texts, one of which read that he hoped she'd be abused and that her mother would be poisoned by the flowers she gifted her. After sending the messages, he arrived outside Silva's family home on the night of May the 13th and was behaving belligerently. His girlfriend and her brother Miguel went outside and tried to de-escalate the situation. Polkinghorne punched Silva, and as he was preparing to take another swing at her, the woman ran inside and grabbed a knife. She returned to find Polkinghorne on top of Miguel, pummeling him with his fists. As the woman later told the police in a video-recorded interview, Polkinghorne was gearing up for a big punch, and she noted, "I have felt that punch before." Silva stabbed the man 5 times in the head and back, inflicting fatal injuries. She went on to plead not guilty to murder on the basis of self-defense, but a jury eventually found her guilty of manslaughter. The sentencing judge noted that there were extreme circumstances to the killing, as Silva's fear of Polkinghorne had gradually built up due to the prolonged abuse she'd experienced at his hands. She was given a prison sentence of 2 years, suspended on the condition of good behavior. Number 4. Emerald Wardle. An Australian teenager was strangled to death by her boyfriend in June of 2020 after the man had allegedly suffered a psychotic break. 18-year-old Emerald Wardle lived with Jordan Brody Miller in the small and quiet neighborhood of Medford, near Maitland. Miller was taken into custody in the early hours of June the 20th and told officers at the scene that he'd killed a demon that had been sucking the life out of him. He admitted to have taken psychedelic drugs a few days earlier and claimed to have experienced a spiritual enlightenment. Miller claimed that he became very smart and realized that there was a curse on him that could only be lifted by ending his own life or by killing Wardle. He never denied that he'd been responsible for her murder, but the crux of the trial that followed was determining whether his psychotic break had been drug-induced or if it originated from chronic schizophrenia. The prosecution argued that there were signs Miller knew his girlfriend was human and not a demon. Miller's defense proposed that he was unaware what he'd done was morally and legally wrong because of his mental condition, which was exacerbated by drug use. After a 3-week trial at Newcastle Supreme Court from May to June of 2022, the jury agreed with the prosecution and found Miller guilty of murder, with his sentencing scheduled for August the 18th. Number 3. Brandy Nicole Floyd. In the morning hours of April the 5th of 2012, guests at the Hollywood Casino Hotel in Tunica County, Mississippi, overheard arguing in one of the rooms. The establishment staff called law enforcement, who forced their way into the room, where they found 25-year-old Brandy Nicole Floyd unresponsive on the floor. The woman, who was several weeks pregnant at the time, had been stabbed multiple times with an unspecified sharp object. Her injuries ultimately proved fatal. She'd traveled to the casino with her boyfriend Nathaniel Yates III, whom police officers found at the scene. In an attempt to evade arrest, Yates jumped through the glass of the first-floor window before officers subdued him using a taser and took him into custody. He was treated for the cuts and bruises he'd sustained in the escape attempt and subsequently charged with murder. He and Floyd lived together in Collierville, where neighbors and friends described the latter as a very sweet girl, but noted that she was terrified of her boyfriend. The police had recently been called to their house to reports of domestic violence, and Yates also had a prior drug conviction. Number 2. Amy Hargrove. Throughout their on-again, off-again relationship, which had begun in the early 2010s, Washington woman Amy Hargrove reported that she'd been abused by her boyfriend, Burrell Cushman. 28-year-old Hargrove took out 2 protection orders against the man, who was also a father to one of her 3 children. During the 2012 filing, Hargrove wrote that she'd been close to dying because of Cushman's anger and knew a piece of paper wouldn't stop him from coming after her, adding, "At least you will know who killed me." She also revealed the abuse she'd suffered at Cushman's hands, which included him giving her black eyes and forcing himself onto her at gunpoint. The woman took out another protective order in 2013, which was still in effect in January of the following year, when she was living with her toddler son in an apartment connected to her mother's home in Kirkland. Hargrove's mother, Janet Ford, became concerned on January the 6th After it emerged that she'd failed to turn up for her shift at Olive Garden, Ford went to check on her daughter and found her lifeless body lying face down on her bed. She had been dead for almost a day, and a medical examination would subsequently determine that she'd been fatally strangled. There was also a pot of boiled over oil on the kitchen stove, turned on high heat, which led authorities to suspect that her killer had attempted to burn down her apartment. Hargrove's son had called Ford in tears the previous afternoon, claiming that she and Cushman had had a fight. The man was arrested for violating his protective order. After admitting that he'd spent the weekend with Hargrove, he denied hurting her, proposing that one of her other ex-boyfriends had been responsible. They were, however, ruled out following an investigation, and in July of 2014, Cushman was charged with Hargrove's murder. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Number 1. Roderick Deakin-White. By April of 2019, Australian woman Amy Parsons, aged 34, had become increasingly unhappy in her relationship with fiancé Roderick Deakin-White, with whom she lived in Whitechapel, East London. The couple's intimate life had turned into a source of conflict, as the woman reportedly took issue with Deakin-White's cross-dressing habits. The man had a Facebook page under the alter ego Jane, and he would wear women's lingerie and makeup whenever they had relations. Parsons had grown weary of the fetish, which reportedly left her unsatisfied in the bedroom and threatened to end the relationship with Deakin-White if he didn't stop. She then went out for coffee with work colleague James Saunders, and a romance blossomed. The pair became intimate on April the 14th. Less than 2 weeks later, Parsons would be dead. She admitted to Deakin-White that she'd begun seeing someone else and, on April the 25th, resolved to end her relationship with him. They drank wine and Prosecco on their balcony when Parsons told the man that she was leaving. Deakin-White reportedly begged her to rethink the breakup, but she was determined to start a new relationship with Saunders. The last message that the woman ever sent was a love heart to the latter. While Parsons was taking a shower, Deakin-White grabbed a detachable 2-foot-long chin-up bar. He burst into the bathroom and repeatedly struck the woman whom he'd dated for 8 years as she was naked and unable to defend herself. The heavy blows impacted Parsons' head, inflicting fatal injuries and splattering blood all over the bathroom. After killing the woman, the stranger convinced him to surrender to the authorities. In the trial that followed, he admitted manslaughter, claiming he'd lost control. A jury, however, found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 17 years in prison. Thanks for watching. Would you rather go on a date with a wanted fugitive or give all of your exes complete access to your cell phone? Let us know in the comments section below.